Good weekend to you. Welcome to Leading Edge. I'm Jerry Anderson. This is our first broadcast now since Joe Biden was declared president-elect a week ago. I said on last week's program that I fully expect days, if not weeks, if not more, of legal challenges. And when it comes to law, my go-to guy is law professor Lee Strang from the University of Toledo. There he's been named the John W. Stempler Professor of Law in Values. He is the author of Originalism's Promise, a natural law account of the American Constitution. Graduated law school where?
University of Iowa.
There you go. Thanks for being, yes, I got you. Nice to have you with us. All right, let's start with these legal challenges. I'm not a lawyer, clearly, but I know someone doesn't walk into court and say, Your Honor, our candidate stood for election. The vote counters say he didn't win, and we don't agree with that, so we would like you to make him the winner. It doesn't work that way. So what burden of proof do lawsuit filers have to carry to get traction into the courts?
Yeah, that's a really complicated answer, Jerry, and it's because we're in different courts. So some of these cases are in state court, some in federal court. We have different claims. Some are state law claims, some are federal claims, and then some of the factual allegations in the different cases are different as well. So some of them deal with, for example, in Pennsylvania, one of the allegations by the Trump campaign is that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court misinterpreted Pennsylvania law, and by doing so allowed more votes that were counted that should not have been counted. And that's basically what we would call a legal issue where there's not really a dispute about what the facts are. Everybody agrees the Supreme Court did that. It's just a question of whether the Pennsylvania Supreme Court acted unconstitutionally. But a lot of the cases, Jerry, involve allegations of misuse of state election procedures. And I went through a number of the affidavits this morning. And just so everybody knows, we're at the stage now where there have been complaints filed, and complaints will have affidavits. Those are sworn statements by witnesses saying, if I were called to court, this is what I would say. And that's not nothing, but it's also not somebody in court who's being cross-examined by an attorney as well. So we have to take everything we're seeing with a grain of salt.
Can lawsuit filers use their action to pursue a fishing expedition? That is to say something, in effect, they wouldn't say this verbatim, but in effect say, vote just doesn't feel right, and Your Honor, you should find out why.
So it may be the case, I'm sure it's the case, that the Trump campaign and many of these different lawsuits wants to have access to more information, because one of their claims is that our observers were actually shut out of the observation process. And so we need to be able to have a recount of some or all of different ballots to be able to find out what actually happened. And so I guess one way to describe that would be a fishing expedition, but another way to describe it would be we have evidence that something occurred, but we need to have more evidence to evaluate whether the bad things actually occurred or not. And so I don't think a fishing expedition would be the right label for this situation.
Shouldn't every close big state be recounted? In fact, isn't it mandatory in most places?
So we're primarily dealing with state law here, as we talked about, and most states have mandatory recount requirements if the vote is within a certain percentage. So some states have it as 0.5%, some states say 1%, and then some states like Wisconsin do 1% plus if there's an objection by one of the parties. And so most states have it. Georgia is currently doing or is preparing for a vote recount. I wouldn't be surprised if states like Pennsylvania do a recount. Some of the states like Michigan, frankly, they're pretty far apart, and so that would be a hard hump for the Trump campaign to overcome, even if there is some voter fraud going on.
The Attorney General has unleashed U.S. attorneys around the country to find and report irregularities. Mr. Barr has consistently appeared to be the president's personal attorney, especially as personal attorney Rudy Giuliani tends to make Joe Biden look Ken Jennings sharp on some days. Should we be politicizing the Department of Justice more than it already has been?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jerry. And so on the one hand, the Attorney General is somebody who is always picked by the president because we want the president, who is the executive officer, to have somebody who is his right-hand person who is enforcing the law to be somebody the president trusts and agrees with. So in that sense, the Attorney General is always political. But on the other hand, the Department of Justice has a long-standing tradition of trying to some degree, maintain an independent observer status. And there's been lots of allegations that Attorney General Barr has gone beyond those traditional lines. And certainly critics of President Trump are going to point to this as another example of that. And in fact, inside the Department of Justice, there was a resignation by a prominent Department of Justice official saying exactly that. This is what we're supposed to be doing.
So many cases out there. Lee Strang walking us through things to watch for, how there are so many different cases based on different circumstances in different states. Then there could be something going on even beyond just cases in court. I want to get to that with Professor Lee Strang. Got to take a break. Can you hang with me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Lee Strang is with us. This is Leading Edge. I'm back right after this. Back on Leading Edge, Professor Lee Strang, College of Law, University of Toledo. My guest, we're talking about the legal challenges in many states around the country to the election of this past week. Some sources, Lee Strang, as you know, suggest that all of this is just to slow the process, to, as I heard the other day, pour sand in the gears of the electoral count. Slowing is important because states are under a calendar deadline to certify their elections. Absent that happening on that date, then we're looking to what? State legislatures? And that's interesting. Walk me through that.
Yeah. So in response to situations in the past where there have been debates in states about who's the actual candidate for president or some other offices as well, Congress has passed a series of federal statutes. And one of the key statutes is that states have to tell the federal government by, in this year, December 8th, who their electors are going to be. And so one claim out there is that President Trump's strategy is actually not to win these cases, not to show that there was sufficient fraud that shows that he actually was the winner of these elections in Pennsylvania or Oregon, but to run clocks. That way the legislatures in Pennsylvania and Michigan, which are controlled by Republicans, will say, we don't want to lose our electors, and we, the legislature, will designate the Trump electors as the electors for the vote in December.
Okay, let me go through that. You brought up Michigan. That's a great point. Hello, Michigan viewers. Thank you, as always. If the state legislature up in Michigan names Trump electors, despite a 150,000 vote margin in favor of Biden, is that not overturning the will of the voters?
That would seem to be a situation where that would occur, right? So, unless you as a legislator had a sound reason to believe that the 150,000 vote count did not actually evidence the will of the voters, and viewers can make up their own minds what they read. If you go online, you can see all the affidavits that are there presented, and there are a lot of affidavits that talk about what I think could be fairly characterized as systemic exclusion of GOP observers, and then changes to the ballots that were occurring. Now, I don't know if that's 150,000 votes worth. Pennsylvania's closer. Arizona is closer still. So there's lots of states that are close. And a legislator might say to him or herself, given what I've read in the cases, given what I've seen, given the evidence that I have, I think that the election actually was for President Trump. Now, I'm not saying that anybody's going to come to that conclusion, but that, I think, is the kind of reasoning process you'd have to do to be consistent with America's commitment to democratic republicanism.
Lee Strang, okay, let's go back to the affidavits that may suggest, counting, voting more than once or not giving access to. Does the court then say, well, let's bring somebody in who was there? Do we take this affidavit as, well, that's statement of fact, it must be, or do we have somebody else come in and respond to that and say, no, that's not the way it was at all?
That's right. So we're at one of the challenges is litigation typically plays out over months and months. Yeah. We don't have that here. And so courts are under tremendous pressures to try and allow each side to have its voice while at the same time giving for example, here, the president's campaign, it's just day in court. And so now the opposing side in each of these cases, typically state officials, will be able to file their briefs, and they'll have evidence, affidavits saying, no, this actually didn't occur at that date and that time. And the remedies that the Trump campaign are looking for depend on the case. So sometimes they're looking for, we want to recount, and that can be quickly done. Yeah. Sometimes they're looking for exclusion of voters of ballots that meet certain criteria, like they didn't have signatures on them, which under state law would be required. And so it just depends on the type of case as to what the remedy is looking for. And sometimes courts will be open to it, like a recount, and sometimes courts will be less open to it, like in the Pennsylvania case, excluding all of the post-election day ballots.
I know you have an interesting take on this, and this is probably not fair to you. I got like a minute to go. From the time the president came out on election night and said, I think we've won this thing, and we're going to take this to the U.S. Supreme Court, I've said, that's the end game. Get it to the Supreme Court. I mean, he put 3 of those people on the court. Isn't that the end game strategy here? And if that happens, isn't Donald Trump virtually assured of victory? Lee Strang, give me a half minute.
Yeah, I don't think so for 2 reasons. One is that there are very few legal issues that can get to the U.S. Supreme Court that could result in 50,000 votes in Pennsylvania, 150,000 in Michigan. So I don't think even if he gets there, he'll get those votes. And number 2, the justices in the Supreme Court view themselves, and I think rightly so, as not being beholden to any elected official. And so I think it would be mistaken to think that those nominees by President Trump are going to in some way put the thumb on the scale for him.
Just the best, as always. Professor Lee Strang, nailing it. These are just fascinating times. Thanks for keeping us on the leading edge of litigating an election. Will the courts be making decisions that ultimately determine the most contentious election? We're back with more after this.